I wonder how good you are at doing what you're told. I'm not sure that it's something that comes naturally, or maybe that's just me. But we're taught from an early age to do as we're told, to obey our parents, our teachers, our leaders, maybe our pastors. Daniel chapter 3 features an act of disobedience. If you haven't read Daniel chapter 3 recently, it might be worth pausing this video and reading it now. Today we'll see how Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, are commanded to worship an idol, but they refuse, they disobey. It's an act of disobedience. Before we get into this chapter, I have a confession to make. I wonder if that got your attention. But I confess it's nothing earth-shattering. I confess to having a couple of questions regarding the story in Daniel chapter 3. It's not so much a case of where's Wally as where's Daniel? Where is Daniel in this story? He's not mentioned once in the story. This story in Daniel chapter 3 is just about his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. Which begs the question, did Daniel bow down to the idol that the king set up? If he did, why? If he didn't, why didn't he get told on, dobbed in? And who did the telling? Who dobbed in Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego? Was it the same people whose lives Daniel had effectively spared back in chapter 2 by telling the king what his dream was and interpreting it? And if it was, why? Why would they dob him in? Well, perhaps it's that they were jealous because Daniel had been promoted as a result of what he did. Another question I have on Daniel chapter 3. Why was the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual? Wasn't it normally hot enough to do the job? And surely the hotter it was, the quicker it would do the job. So better rather than worse for those sentenced to be thrown in. And also, who measured how hot it was and how did they do the measuring? I can't answer those questions, but I can answer the question that King Nebuchadnezzar asked in verse 15 when Daniel's three friends are brought before the king and the king offers them a final chance to worship the idol and says, if they don't worship the idol, they'll be thrown into the blazing or fiery furnace, and asks, what God will be able to save you from my power? Nebuchadnezzar doesn't expect an answer. He thinks it's a rhetorical question with the obvious answer, no God will be able to save you from my power. But Daniel's three friends don't see it that way. They know that their God, Yahweh, will be able to save them or can save them. Now, if you read the book of Daniel and the stories, there sometimes appears to be a disconnect between the various stories in the book. There isn't a flow to the book, to the account. The stories at times seem rather standalone, and I guess perhaps they originally were before they were written down. Several times the king meets Daniel or his friends, and it appears from the conversation as if it's the first time he's met them. Several times we read that Daniel or his friends are promoted. Perhaps they got lots of promotions, I guess. But it's as if the king sometimes suffers from amnesia as well as paranoia. In chapter 2, the king is amazed at Daniel's God giving Daniel not only the meaning of his troubled dream, but revealing what the dream itself was. Anyway, back to chapter 3, or almost, because even though the king is impressed with Daniel's God's ability to tell him his dream and interpret it, a dream that foretold the demise of Nebuchadnezzar's empire, rather than being humbled by this, as it appears to be the case at the end of chapter 2, in the first verse of chapter 3, he's having a statue built. Not necessarily a statue himself, it was quite probably the statue of a god, maybe the king's favourite god. Now, maybe what Nebuchadnezzar is doing in having this statue made is a reaction to what the dream in the previous chapter had foretold. Maybe he thinks he needs to do more to try to secure the future of his empire and consolidate his power. Or maybe some time has passed and he'd forgotten about the dream, the interpretation, and Daniel's God. But the king demands worship. He demands obedience to both himself as king and to the statue or the empire that it's referring to. And he demands allegiance, total allegiance to him and his gods. He has a statue made. It's a 90-foot tall gold statue, and it's set up on the plains of Dura. Now, no one knows for sure where the plains of Dura were, but it's likely they were close to Babylon itself. This statue that he has built probably reminds us of the statue in the king's dream in the previous chapter. And perhaps too it reminds us, and maybe Daniel's friends as well, of the statue of the golden calf that the children of Israel cast when Moses was up Mount Sinai receiving the tablets of stone with the 10 commandments written on them. The statue is all gold, and this suggests, if you remember the statue in the king's dream in the last chapter, suggests it's about the current empire. As I said, we aren't told what it was a statue of, but in verse 18 of chapter 3, Daniel's 3 friends said that they will never serve the king's gods or worship the gold statue. So it may have been a statue of the king, but so more likely it was a statue of his favourite god. And the king requires everyone to bow down and worship the statue when they hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and other stringed instruments. Everyone is to bow down and worship, not just his own people, but everyone, all races, all nations, all languages, everybody within the province of Babylon. This does then appear to be about consolidating power and control. But that's not the problem for Daniel's friends. Daniel's friends are already acting as advisors to the king. They are part of his government, in effect, although it is in reality more of a dictatorship. The problem for Daniel's friends is the not inconsiderable problem of those tablets of stone that Moses received from God at Mount Sinai, and what was written on them, the 10 commandments, and specifically the first couple of commandments. The commandments that they must have no other God but Yahweh, and the commandment that you must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on the earth or in the sea. You must not bow down to them or worship them. Crystal clear, no wriggle room there. Daniel's friends draw a line. Daniel's friends refuse to try to wriggle out of this requirement and this command as you or I might have done. Daniel's friends make a stand. When we looked at Daniel chapter 1, we talked about drawing lines this far and no further. The line here was being asked to break the first commandment, you shall have no gods but me. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego were being asked to worship a created thing, albeit one that represented the power of the state, but they refused. They, as followers of Yahweh, knew that he required them to give their allegiance to him alone. They refused to bow down and worship the idol. They are betrayed. They're offered a second chance, but they turn down the offer. And then they make this wonderful statement that we read in verses 16 to 18 of Daniel chapter 3. We don't need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Confidence, obedience, humour. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego believed that God was able to save them, but they didn't know whether he would. That doesn't matter to them because they aren't going to serve Nebuchadnezzar's gods even if their God doesn't rescue them. Think about that. The king is furious. The king commands the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. As I said, I'm not sure how this was done or how you would know it was 7 times hotter. But 7 is considered the perfect number in Hebrew thought. So this perhaps simply means that the furnace was to be perfectly hot, or as hot as it could be. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego are bound and they're thrown into the furnace. And we read that those throwing them in get more than a little scorched in the process. But then the miracle occurs. The king sees not 3, but 4 men in the furnace. Not only that, the 4 men are unbound and unharmed. The 4th looks like a god. Later, the king refers to the 4th figure as being an angel. But many people regard this figure as being a pre-incarnate Christ. The king calls them out of the furnace, and in doing so, he acknowledges their God, calling them servants of the Most High God. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego step out of the perfectly hot furnace totally unharmed. They didn't even smell of smoke, we're told. Nebuchadnezzar praises Yahweh. He issues a new decree that anyone speaking against the Most High God will be severely punished, and he acknowledges there is no God who can rescue like this. In doing so, Nebuchadnezzar answers his own question from earlier. And Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego get another promotion. What a story. What a rescue and what a God. But what can this story teach us? Now, it might be obvious, but Daniel's 3 friends end up in the blazing furnace. They have to go through this trial. They're not spared the trial, but God is with them in it, and he saves them in it or through it, not from it. God doesn't always deliver us from evil or deliver us from trials in the sense that we don't have to go through the trials and the difficulties. But this story, this account shows us that God is with us in the trials and the difficulties that we go through. We may not be able to see God as we go through those difficult times. We don't know if Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego saw the angel or Christ in the furnace with them. But it doesn't mean he's not there with us. And that may be what we're going through right now. We're having to go through this testing time. We're having to suffer, and followers of Jesus aren't exempt from the suffering. Again, it may be stating the obvious, but followers of Jesus are in lockdown, are getting ill, are dying. God doesn't deliver Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego from the blazing furnace so much as deliver them in it or through the experience. God doesn't always stop us going through bad stuff, but when we do go through that bad stuff, he is with us in it. God doesn't always deliver us from evil, but gives us the power to resist it. God doesn't lead us into temptation, but neither does he keep us away from it. But again, he gives us the strength to resist it. Does Daniel chapter 3 teach us that God will rescue us from every bad situation? No. Does Daniel 3 teach us that God is with us in every bad, difficult situation? Yes, it does. Daniel 3 is about obedience. Obedience is better than sacrifice, as Samuel told King Saul when Saul did his own thing rather than follow God's instructions, as we read in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Daniel chapter 3 is also about worship, about who we should give worth to, who we should worship. God, the creator, not created things. The statue in Daniel 3 being a very obvious example of a created thing. But for us, created things, idols, won't often be physical idols, but they could be other people, celebrities. They could be hobbies or pastimes, careers, our home, our business, or anything else created that takes the place of the Creator. How does the second commandment end? I lay the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generation of those who reject me. But I lavish unfailing love for 1,000 generations on those who love me and obey my commands. Here sin is equated with idolatry, and here blessing is equated with obedience. Sin is idolatry, worshipping, giving allegiance to created things rather than the Creator. And this has long-term consequences. It's not saying God will punish to the third and fourth generation. Rather, the effects of sin, idolatry, tend to last, and often they last down through several generations. It is saying that obedience brings long-term blessing, and the impact of that blessing is often felt down through the generations. And perhaps we can see how that's worked itself through our ancestors, our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. I'm not sure whether this is a threat and a promise or simply a statement of fact. There are negative consequences when we go off track, and they can have long-term impact. And there are positive consequences when we're obedient, and they too can have long-term impact. So that's Daniel chapter 3. Obedience, worship, idolatry, God's deliverance, the assurance of God's presence with us in the trials of life, the trials that we all face. The Hebrews in exile in and around Babylon, strangers in a strange land, would have taken great comfort from this account of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego's run-in with authority and deliverance in through the blazing furnace. The Hebrews at the time of Jesus' earthly ministry, suffering oppression in their own land at the hands of the Romans, continued to take comfort from this account. May we, as we face the current challenges and difficulties which life is throwing at us, take comfort and assurance from the book of Daniel. And may we know and feel God's presence with us as we go through those trials, whether God delivers us from them or is with us through them and in them. Amen.